The scan was already running when I realized we had made a fundamental error in the study design. Not a procedural error. Consent forms were signed. The chamber was calibrated. Subject Rael Orveth, human male, 31 standard years, 14 years of active service with the Terran Frontier Defense Corps, was seated in the assessment cradle with his arms resting loose on the support rails, watching the holographic readout above him with the mild curiosity of a man reading a transit schedule. He was cooperative. He had been cooperative since intake. He answered every questionnaire with flat precision and waited between questions without fidgeting, which the intake staff had noted as unusual. Most subjects in grief load assessment studies fidget. It is a reliable early indicator of suppression strain. Rael Orveth did not fidget. He was simply still. The error I am describing was conceptual. It lived in the assumption we had all carried into the chamber without examining it. An assumption so foundational to our entire field that none of us had thought to name it. We assumed that grief and function existed on a single axis. That as one rose, the other fell. That the neurochemical architecture of catastrophic loss was, by biological necessity, a governor, a circuit breaker, that reduced operational output in proportion to grief load, protecting the organism from spending itself into collapse. Every species in our Institute's records behaved this way. The grief threshold varied. Kethvas, like myself, reached functional impairment at a grief index of roughly E.6. The Sorvale reached it earlier, near 0.4. The most resilient species we had studied, the Vrethian, sustained borderline function up to 0.7 before the behavioral record showed degradation. These numbers were facts. They were the bedrock of our classification system. I pulled up Rael Orveth's behavioral record on the secondary display while the primary scan ran. 10 years of service, 3 deployments, 41 confirmed engagements. I scrolled to the 18-month window that the referring officer had flagged. The period following the loss of his unit at the Dawnhold engagement, where a defensive action had collapsed, and 37 of his 40-person formation had been killed inside 6 hours. I had read the summary at intake. I was now reading the operational record in full, in parallel with the live scan. The scan on the primary display showed a grief index of 0.91. I want to be precise about what that number means. On our scale, 0.91 is not extreme grief. It is not even elevated grief in the way a layperson might understand the phrase. It is the kind of number that, in any species we had previously studied, would correspond to clinical incapacitation, the inability to perform basic sequential tasks, significant impairment of spatial reasoning, near total withdrawal from social interaction. At 0.91, Kethvai subject would be non-functional by any professional standard. We would have classified them as requiring immediate care. I looked at the behavioral record for the same 18-month period. My colleague Maev Orthsen, seated at the tertiary console to my left, said quietly, "Are the feeds synced?" I checked, they were synced. The grief index of 0.91 was not a historical reading. It was not a residual echo from the Dawnhold engagement. It was the current, live, real-time neurochemical state of the man, sitting 4 meters away from me, watching the holographic display with mild interest. The behavioral record for the 18 months following Dawnhold showed the following. Rael Orveth had returned to active duty 11 days after the engagement. He had participated in 7 subsequent defensive operations. His tactical decision records, logged automatically by the Corps Command System, showed response latency figures in the top 6th percentile for his rank and species. His spatial coordination scores had not declined. His team protection rate, a metric the Terran military used to measure a commander's effectiveness at keeping subordinates alive, had actually improved. In the month following Dawnhold, it had risen by 14%. Maev said, "Run it again." I ran it again. The grief index was 0, C3 on the second pass. The scan was, if anything, more accurate. We had caught him at a slightly higher amplitude. Orveth glanced at us through the chamber glass. "Everything okay?" he asked. His voice was level. He sounded faintly concerned. Not for himself. Us. I told him the calibration was running long. He nodded and looked back at the display. My second colleague, Dr. Peth Voss, a senior behavioral analyst who had been with the Institute for 30 years, had not spoken since the second scan completed. He was reading the behavioral record over Maev's shoulder. I watched him reach the section covering the 72 hours immediately following the dawn hold collapse, the period in which 37 people Rael Orveth had served with for an average of 6 years were confirmed dead. The core record showed that during those 72 hours, Orveth had submitted a full after-action report, 11 pages, cross-referenced against 3 separate sensor logs, conducted individual debrief sessions with the 3 survivors, and identified 2 tactical corrections that were subsequently adopted as standing doctrine by the Frontier Defense Corps for that class of engagement. The report had been filed 48 hours after the action. It was, by the assessment of the reviewing officer, among the clearest documents of its kind submitted that year. Peth Voss straightened up. He said nothing. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room. The Ethics Board observer, a junior assessor named Sorvith Thane, who had been assigned to the study to satisfy institutional review requirements, and who had, until this point, been quietly reviewing forms on a handheld terminal, set down the terminal. He was looking at the primary display. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "I would like to be excused." I said, "Of course." He left without looking at the subject through the glass. I sat with the data for a long time after that. The grief was not suppressed. I want to be very clear on this point, because suppression was the first alternative hypothesis we examined, and we examined it thoroughly. Suppression produces a characteristic neurochemical signature, a damping pattern in the secondary limbic register, measurable compression of the grief response cascade. It is not invisible. We would have seen it. There was no suppression signature in Rael Orveth's scan. The grief was fully present. It was fully active. Every marker our field had ever associated with acute, unprocessed, ongoing loss was running at near maximum amplitude, and the function was also fully present. Fully active, running in parallel on a separate channel, neither diminishing the other nor being diminished. We do not have a model for this. I have reviewed the Institute's entire archive, 412 years of neurological research across 61 documented species, and I cannot find a precedent. The closest analog in our literature is a theoretical paper from the early period of Keth, vi psychological research, in which a junior scholar proposed the existence of a hypothetical cognitive architecture capable of sustaining parallel, operational channels under maximum grief load. The paper was rejected for publication on the grounds that no biological substrate for such an architecture had ever been identified, and that positing it without evidence was not science but speculation. The paper was correct. We simply had not yet met the species it described. When the session ended, I released Rael Orveth from the assessment cradle and walked him to the exit corridor. He thanked me for my time. I asked him, carefully, because I was not sure how to ask it, whether he was all right. He considered the question with what seemed like genuine thought. Then he said, "I carry it with me, that's all. It doesn't go away." He paused. "I don't think it's supposed to." I thanked him and went back to my console. That was 4 months ago. I have written and discarded 11 versions of the assessment summary. The 12th version, the one I finally submitted, uses language I do not think fully captures what we observed. The language our field has available was built for a different kind of organism. What I can say, with precision, is this. Every grief response model our institute has ever produced rests on the assumption that loss, above a certain amplitude, interrupts function. We built our entire therapeutic framework on that interruption, on treating the interruption, managing it, shortening it. We assumed the interruption was universal because in every species we had ever examined it was. The human data does not show an interruption. It shows something we do not yet have a name for. A species that learned, at some point in its history, to carry full grief and full function simultaneously, as a normal operating state indefinitely. I think about the 37 names in the dawn hold record. I think about the after-action report filed 48 hours later, 11 pages. It's referenced, clinically precise. I do not know what it costs them. That is the part the scan cannot show me. I find I am not sure I want to know.